In 1992, Psycho Dream was released on the Super Famicom, where it would remain exclusively for over 25 years. While there were plans to bring it to the Western market under the name Dream Probe, the project was ultimately abandoned. On today's episode of Shook with Nostalgia, we'll be checking out one of the most imaginative action platformers of the 16-bit era. A game that most people, despite growing up in the age of Psycho Dream, have probably never heard of, much less played it. The vision of the game really comes together when you learn the game's story. It sets the tone and makes some of the artistic choices that may seem bizarre for the sake of it make a lot more sense in the end. For this, we're going to check out the game's manual, as it doesn't really get into this in the game itself. In the early 1980s, a new entertainment medium, known as drug movies, hit the streets of Japan. As these virtual reality experiences gained popularity, some people began to abandon reality for them, sometimes even getting stuck inside of them while their bodies starved in the real world. Not long after their release, the Japanese government started a special task force employing agents who would enter these D-movies to rescue those who had sank too deep either on purpose or against their will. Our story starts a decade later in 1992. A 17-year-old girl by the name of Yuki Sayaka sinks deep into a popular D-movie known as Haito Monogatari, or The Story of the Ruined Capital. 3 days pass before it's discovered that Yuki is trapped in this nightmare. We're told at this point she could die at any minute. You play through the game as one of two characters, Shijima Ryo and Tobari Maria. While both of these characters have a special form that you can evolve into if you collect enough power-ups, Maria's final form is significantly more powerful than Ryo's. Her fairy form can spam not just projectiles, but homing projectiles. Ryo gets the points for style though, as he goes full cyborg, also firing a ton of projectiles, just not homing projectiles. Once you make your choice of character, you're going to be playing through 6 levels, or tracks as Psycho Dream calls them. As you play the game, Yuki will occasionally make appearances. During a boss battle where you're fighting a giant moth, you'll actually start the fight by taking a few whacks at this piece of translucent rock that Yuki is trapped inside of. The final boss of the game actually has her trapped inside of his body in similar fashion. In Psycho Dream, you'll be fighting a ton of strange enemies, many of which are twisted versions of real-life things. There are these blue bird creatures that can morph into a ball and bounce around at you in the first level. But it's not long before there are these face huggers jumping off of a train in the subway while babies float by, damaging you before you have any time to react to it. The icing on the cake for these initial subway levels is the first boss, which is one of the game's most frustrating. This squid-like horror creature fights you in a small room filled with computer screens that are going to be broken by the end of the fight, as it can stick its tentacles through them as well as through the ceiling to try and stab you. This is the only time in the game where I felt like getting the gun power-up was worth it. Your normal attacks in Psycho Dream are melee, but when a yellow power-up drops, if you wait a few seconds, it'll eventually turn blue. The blue power-up will switch your primary attack into a gun, which I found to be mostly useless except in this fight. Get the gun and you can just shoot the boss down in a few seconds while standing safely near the edge of the screen. Otherwise, you'll need to run up and slowly get a hit or two on its massive eyes on its head. The difficulty in Psycho Dream is kind of all over the place. Even with Ryo, some of the levels can be beaten in a minute or two on your first time. Some of the other levels though will make you thankful for the game's unlimited continues, a feature I'm a big fan of in general and especially in this game. This level is a mechanics and mental fortitude gauntlet. It's a fever dream of a stage, where you need to strike these objects to break the barriers of thorns down. That's the main gameplay loop of the stage. But while you're doing this, you're being bombarded by respawning flying enemies. And also, maybe the coolest enemy in this game, this snake-like creature that cannot be damaged or interacted with at all besides taking damage from it. In this stage, you're escorting a cart through some mines, while enemies and boulders try to kill you. You have to be careful not to stand in front of the cart or be touching it at all when it goes over these holes in the ground. If you mess this up, or fall down there yourself, the level will have you running around in loops until it decides to set you back at the start. To this day, I am unable to articulate the nuances of this level. You just have to play it for yourself to understand how frustrating this cart is. I know more about what I can't do in this level than what I can. This stage is probably the lowest point in the game. It's not difficult, but I wouldn't call it easy either. All you do is hit these enemy spawners as they occasionally shoot out some basic enemies. But you have to hit these things like 30 times, and there's a ton of them. Once you do this, you're put into basically the same stage again. Your character has a mirror image fighting with you in this stage, but it doesn't really affect gameplay. Despite this stage being terrible, the music is awesome, and it might have my favorite song in the game. Luckily, you'll get to listen to the entire thing several times on these stages. Some of the other music in the game, however, is not such easy listening. Take this track for example in this side-scrolling stage. Mixed with the bizarre cast of enemies here, it really starts to go off the deep end. Earlier in the game, when you're in the subway, you'll be listening to a track that almost sounds like it's mocking you, constantly switching between equally disturbing melodies. This stage actually contains another awesome track hidden within it. To hear it though, you'll have to die in the section of this second level that has the moving train in the background, and when you get a game over and select retry, a new song will be playing in place of the old one, a song you only get to hear during this specific part of the game. This stage isn't especially difficult, and it's a very specific section of stage 2, so it's very easy to survive these couple of screens and totally miss it, but it's worth a quick death to check out, as it's one of the coolest and least insane tracks in the game. This curse stage, where you're escorting a cart, plays an equally twisted, carnival-like tune that I found to make each failure in the stage hurt a little bit more than the last one. While each stage has its own music, the boss fight music is an awesome tune that, besides the final battle, you'll actually hear during all of the boss fights throughout the game. Once you've made your way into the center of the ruined capital, having slain several twisted versions of giant insects, a floating squid while you're sprinting down a Japanese freeway, and this creature, you'll face your final challenge. The final boss of Psychodream is this huge, cybernetic dream titan. Inside his stomach, you'll see Yuki encased inside. Towering over you, you'll use platforms to initially fight just his hands. Luckily, you only have to battle one at a time. They spew constant projectiles at you in 4 directions, and with each of his hands taking 12 hits to kill, this fight is not easy. During it, the music is an interesting twist on what the game has been feeding you up to this point. It's a Psychodream interpretation of Ave Maria. I found it an awesome choice, and a great subversion of expectations for the final boss. Once you destroy both of his arms, his head will detach and you'll enter the final phase of the fight. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you won't have to worry about projectiles in this at all, but that's sort of rare and it's usually going to be a mess. If you have any screen clearing attacks saved up, now is the time to use them. You'll take a sizable chunk out of the boss's health. It's worth noting that once you get into the boss fight, or any boss fight in Psychodream, despite power-ups dropping during these battles, you cannot get enough to transform into your final form. So if you lose fairy form right before the final boss, or if you manage to maintain it but you don't defeat him on your first try, you're going to be abusing that continue screen with your base form. Once you manage to defeat the final boss, you'll get a nice scene of Yuki being a bit unsure of you, before ultimately jumping into either Ryo or Maria's arms. It's unfortunate that Psycho Dream never properly made its way out of Japan in the 1990s. The game reviewed poorly, and with its abrasive music and design, I can see why bringing it over to the Super Nintendo was abandoned. But it is a shame it took so long to get properly ported over. For such an ambitious project, the game has surprisingly flown under the radar, though even in modern times, it's absolutely worth checking out. That's all for this episode of Shook with Nostalgia. Thanks for tuning in.